Hi, I'm Dr. Stephen Wooding. I'm a Senior Research Leader at RAND Europe, and my presentation today covered the value that society gets from research in mental health and also how we can get more benefit from mental health, what we should look for when we're trying to fund research. Bonjour, malheureusement je ne parle pas français. What can I say? Thank you very much for agreeing to listen to me in English, because that's going to make it an awful lot easier for me and potentially harder for you. I'm going to talk to you today about a couple of studies in the area of mental health. One that tries to say what is mental health research worth, and the second one tries to say how can we get more out of that? How does the mental health research actually work? How does it provide that benefit, and how can you improve that? I'm very happy to take questions. I do have a nasty habit of talking too fast, even for English audiences. So the accepted thing is just to wave. If I see people waving, I will slow down. And if you want to ask questions or something you don't quite understand, something you'd like me to clarify, please stick your hand up, and that would be great. Just kind of heckle. Just a tiny little bit about what the organisation I work for is, what RAND Europe is. We're a not-for-profit public policy think tank, which means that we're somewhere between consultancies and universities. So the work we do, the work I'm going to talk to you about today, is all funded by our clients, but we publish it all. So anybody can then read it in the same way that a university would. And we publish it to the extent that you could either replicate it or build on it. So sometimes you read consultancy reports and they say, this is what we concluded, and you think, how? We publish the how bit as well. So I'm going to talk about two things today. I'm going to talk, as I said, about what is mental health research worth, or how can you provide an estimate of that? And I'm going to talk about how some of that benefit occurs. There are two parts of the value of mental health research, or the way we've calculated it. There are two parts. The first is to do with the health gain and the improvements in health that it provides. And the second bit is that spending money on research provides economic spillovers. So you train people, they're clever, they have better skills afterwards than they had beforehand. They may go off and do other things with those skills. So there are two elements to the economic value of research. There's the actual health interventions and the health that provides, and there's the economic stimulation. I'm going to talk to those in turn. Conceptually, it's very easy to figure this out. The problem comes in all the numbers you have to assume to do it. What you first need to work out is, this study is retrospective. It says how much benefit did we get from mental health research over the past 25 years. And the study we did actually looks at cardiovascular disease, one area, and it looks at mental health. We've also done work looking at cancer to make a similar estimate. I'm going to talk about the mental health one today, obviously. So the first thing you have to work out is how much money was spent on research. Then you have to work out how much health benefit came from that. And finally, and importantly, you have to work out how long did that take. And quite a lot of the studies that have been done in this area look at how much was spent and how much health gain there was, but they don't take any account of how long it took. If I give you £1 now and you give me back £9 at the end of the seminar, that's a much better deal than if I give you £1 now and you give me £9 back in 25 years' time. Yeah, so that time gap is very important. So I'm going to go through how we estimated each of those, and each one there are a forest of assumptions. I think one of the interesting questions about this type of research is, can you get a good enough answer that it's useful? So we went to all of the major funding agencies in the UK, the estimates we attempted to do were for UK medical research, public sector UK medical research. We went to all the funding agencies in the UK and we said, how much money did you spend on mental health over the last 25 years? Oh, wow, sorry, from 1975 to 1992. And most of them said, oh, we don't really know. So we had to we took the records and the grant titles and classified them. Some of the funders already had classifications. The funders didn't use the same classifications. Some of the funding streams aren't particularly classified, but we worked through to try and generate our best estimate of the annual spend on mental health research from 1975 through to 1992 in the UK. So that gives us the inputs, if you like. The second thing we needed to do was to try and determine the outputs. And there are two ways to do this. You can either say, how much better have people got? So if you take the example of cardiovascular disease, there is less cardiovascular morbidity and mortality these days than there was 20 years ago. So you can say things have got better. A lot of that is due to research. How much of it's due to research? Let's say somewhere between a third and a half. And then you look at the change in health and you say that's the benefit of research. The big problem with that approach is if people were iller today, were less well today than they were 25 years ago, you probably wouldn't be saying they're more ill because of research. So what we tried to do was to take each individual intervention, each individual medical treatment, and work out the benefit of that. So if you do it for mental health, SSRIs are a key one. So we looked at SSRIs. We said how much benefit, if we look at clinical studies, the clinical trials, how much benefit do SSRIs provide? If we look at the occurrence data, how many people would they be, are they being given to? And therefore we can try and work out how much benefit comes from that, from SSRIs, and you can work down through the different interventions that we could identify as being research-based and where we could find the information. Now, as I said, in this study we looked at cardiovascular disease and we looked at mental health. We looked at cardiovascular disease because it's really important from morbidity and mortality point of view, but also lots of work on the science of science, trying to understand research, has been done on cardiovascular disease. It's kind of the lab rat of science of science. We looked at mental health because we thought, A, it's important, and B, it would probably be one of the most difficult areas to do. Because there aren't as many different interventions, the data about them is not as good. And that's kind of reflected in the fact that we have a much shorter list here than we have for the cardiovascular disease. So this is probably an underestimate of benefits. So we identify them and then we assessed health gain in terms of QALYs, which is a quality adjusted life years. So effectively, if something extends your life in a perfect situation by 1 year, that's 1 QALY. If it makes you a bit better over that year, if you were very ill and it makes you a little bit better than that, you get some fraction of a QALY. So it's a way of counting health benefit. It's very widely used in the UK. I'm not sure how widely. I don't think it's used quite as widely in France, but I think it's used fairly widely. And we monetized that by there's various different ways to monetize QALYs. In the UK, the organisation in the UK called NICE, the National Institutes for Care, Health and Clinical Excellence, puts a certain value on the QALY to decide whether a treatment is worthwhile. So they are willing to pay about £25,000 for a QALY. And if your treatment comes in as cheaper than that, they say fine. If your treatment costs more than that for each QALY, it doesn't get approved in our National Health Service. So we used that value. There are other ways to determine the value of a QALY. You can ask people what they would pay, for example. And if you do that, a number of studies in the US have done that, and you get a much higher value for a QALY. But we were doing it in the UK, in the context of the health system, so we used the value that's used in the health system. So you multiply the number of QALYs, which is 1.3 million, by 25,000, you get £31 billion of benefit. And then we subtracted off the costs of delivering that benefit, which is about 2.2 billion over the lifetime of the study. So we now know, well, sorry, we have estimated, there's one health economist in the audience, so I have to be very careful of that. Sorry, at least one. We know how much is being spent, or how much was spent. We know how much health has been gained. And the question then is, how long does that take? How long has it taken from the spending going into research to the benefit coming out in terms of health? And again, there are various ways to estimate this. What we chose to do was to say, if we look at clinical guidelines, so in the UK, NICE again produces clinical guidelines that say how particular diseases and disorders should be treated. If we look at those guidelines, what is the age of the papers cited on those guidelines? And you get this kind of graph. So you've got quite a lot around 3 to 5 years old, and it tails off, and you still get things cited that are 25, 27 years old. And the mean age of cited papers is about 12 years. And then we said, well, the paper doesn't come out the instant you get the research money. Clinical practice doesn't change the instant a guideline is published. And and there's big uncertainties on either end of that. We added a couple of years for both of those, and we ended up with an estimate of about 17 years between when you put the money into research and when you get an impact on health, on average. So some things clearly happen much faster than that. Some things may happen a lot slower than that. And if you put all those three numbers together, you get a rate of return of 7% a year, annualized rate of return, internal rate of return of 7%. So that means if I put £1 into research, I would get 7 pence, or if I put €1 into research, I would get 7 cents a year forever. Or I would get the equivalent of that. Because clearly I wouldn't get anything for a bit and then I'd get more. But that's the estimate. That's a reasonable rate of return in terms of public sector investment. But that's only one aspect of what you get from investing in mental health research. The second aspect is the contribution through spillovers. Now, I don't know as much about this because I'm not an industrial economist, but this is the diagram that shows the way in which public and charitable R&D, so public sector research and development, feeds into improved economic performance. I've talked about the value that comes from health. So when you put money into research, you're hoping that you'll develop a new treatment and that will make people healthier. And so I've now talked about how you value that and how you estimate the value of that. And that comes out at about 7% in terms of a rate of return, interest rate, if you like, of 7%. The other aspect, the other economic benefit of spending money on research is that people get new skills, and those skills get used in other areas than in research. So a lot of people who do a PhD, for example, go outside academia afterwards. They go to a company or whatever. So there is a benefit to the economy of putting money into research that is independent of the actual benefits of the specific piece of research. Yeah? So I did my PhD in a cell biology lab. I no longer do cell biology. But I contribute to the economy in other ways. And I probably contribute more than if I didn't have that PhD. I'm not going to try and explain this, but this is the diagram that the economists we work with came up to talk about how public research funding contributes to the economy. And it contributes both directly and via commercial R&D, via private R&D. It's not clear exactly how all of that works, but people have done studies where they've looked at the amount of money invested in the public sector, and they've looked at economic performance, and they've built econometric models to estimate what that spillover effect is. And the estimates they come up with are about 30% a year. So a 30% interest rate, if you like, rate of return. Now, one of the key things about this is most of the work to estimate this number was done on agricultural research in the United States in the 1970s. So it may not be applicable to biomedical research in mental health in the UK or in France, for that matter. And we're currently doing work to try and improve that estimate, because clearly that's a bigger number than the 7% that comes from the health benefit. So if you take those two things together, you've got 30% from the economic spillovers, 7% from the health benefit, which makes a total rate of return or interest rate of 37%. So if you put a euro into public sector medical research, the economy as a whole should get 37 cents a year forever through those two routes. And the thing that strikes me about this is actually the benefit that comes through the spillovers is potentially bigger than the benefit that comes through the health, which is an interesting point sitting as a health researcher, because obviously I was always in it to improve health. I wasn't in it to make the economy. But actually it turns out that that may be a bigger effect. The number for different areas of health is kind of similar. We found 7% was our best estimate for mental health, 9% was our best estimate for cardiovascular disease, I think 10% was our best estimate for cancer. But I would, given the number of assumptions that are made, I think they are all effectively the same number. One of the reasons why the number for health is so much lower, I think, is because the time lag is so great. So that suggests that what you would want to do if you want to improve the benefit to health research is you want to get it into practice quicker. Now clearly there are all sorts of reasons why you have to be careful bringing things into practice, but that's one of the big things that reduces the size of the benefit of health research, if you like. So I was just going to take a second to talk about the impact that this study had in the UK in particular. Am I going any better now? That's perfect. You better? Okay. I suspect it's not perfect, but it might be better. So we had impacts in kind of two spheres. We had an academic impact, if you like, in that Nature picked up the work we'd done, and they said that we were, very nicely said that it was one of the few attempts to objectively assess the benefits of health research. So quite a lot of work has been done that was effectively PR for medical research. So a lot of the work before what we did didn't take account of the time lag. And if you drop out the time lag, the return becomes phenomenal. It's kind of fivefold or even bigger. The other impact we had was this work came out just before we had what in the UK we call a comprehensive spending review, which is when the government sits down and decides how much they're going to spend on different departments. And one of the outcomes of that spending review was big cuts across a lot of government, but also the protection of the research budgets. And we have a letter from the Science Minister saying that one of the things that contributed to the ring fence, the protection of the research budget, was the evidence about the rate of return. It's clearly not the only thing, but it was one of the things, which was nice. So I've talked a bit about how we estimate the value of medical research, or how you can estimate the value of medical research. But that tells you very little about how you would get more benefit from research. It tells you funding research is probably a good idea, or probably was a good idea, if you take the investment advice. I'm now going to talk a little bit about a very different approach to research that I've been involved in, that aims to say, how do you get more benefit from the research you're funding? How can you best fund research? So I'm very happy to take, obviously, any kind of question at the end. If anybody wants to ask a specific question about this, the economic return stuff, then I can take it now, or we can wait. I don't mind. I'll carry on. Okay, so how does medical research provide a health benefit? I've talked already about the fact that one of the big things is this time lag that it takes. It takes a long time between when you fund research to when it has an effect on a patient. There are various other questions about how you fund research. So an obvious split that we talk a lot about in the UK is the difference between basic research, which I think you call fundamental research, and clinical or applied research. And here you can see the Chief Executive of the Medical Research Council, who's one of our major medical research funders, saying that the success of science, or biomedical science, rests on fundamental or basic research. And there are clearly examples where that's true. So Lipitor, which is, I think, the world's best-selling prescription medicine, was clearly designed with an understanding of the process it was designed to interfere with. So it's a statin, it's designed for cholesterol lowering. They understood the metabolic pathway that made cholesterol. They used that knowledge to make Lipitor. On the other hand, clinical research is also clearly important. So this is Dame Sally Davies, the Chief Medical Officer of the UK, of England, in fact, saying that you need experimental medicine to make therapies work. And you want an example in that case, if you look at the cardiovascular work we've done, 30% of the decrease in the burden of heart disease comes from using aspirin. Now, aspirin was not designed with an understanding of cardiovascular disease. It was something that was already existent, and it was figured out by looking in clinical research that it had this benefit on heart disease, and it's one of the major things that has decreased the burden of heart disease. So you can find massive success stories, both taking a basic research perspective or taking a clinical research perspective. And so effectively you've got victories in either camp. The question is, which is actually better? And what I've been doing over the past, I guess, 10 years now, is a series of pieces of work to try and understand in a slightly more systematic way what are the characteristics of research that lead to patient benefit and societal benefit. So I first did work in arthritis, I've done work in cardiovascular disease, and the one I'm going to talk about today is mental health. So an attempt to understand how that benefit comes from the research and how you could improve that. This study was funded by the Graham Beck Foundation, the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, Alberta Innovates, the National Institute for Health Research in the UK, and the National Institute of Mental Health in the US. And it was a 3-year, 3-country study to examine what the impact of mental health was and how that came about. Mental health research was and how that came about. And the approach, so at the economic study I talked about, we looked at an enormously high level. We said how much spending happened on the whole of mental health research and what benefits came from that. This study took a very different approach. It said we will take 18 individual pieces of research and we will follow them forward over about 20 to 25 years to see what they have developed into. So we will follow the people, we will follow the ideas, and we will see how they have developed and what impact those pieces of research have had. At the same time as that, we took 6 treatment advances in mental health that had occurred, and we followed them backwards in time, sometimes to 30 or 40 years, to try and understand where they had come from, what research did they depend on, and then by looking at the routes through which the knowledge and the people flowed, what could we say about how research has an impact, and therefore if we look at pieces of research that have been successful and pieces of research that haven't, can we draw any conclusions about how you should support research? So I'm going to talk a little bit about the methods. And I'm going to concentrate on the forward tracing case studies because of limits of time. I can always talk about the other ones later. Can you hear me at the back if I don't use this? No? Okay, I'll use it. Fine, no problem. So we started with a list of all the highly cited papers from between 1985 and 1990 about schizophrenia. So this study focused on schizophrenia, but because things might have influenced schizophrenia that didn't start off as research on schizophrenia, we looked wider than that. But we started with the things that focused around schizophrenia. And we then classified those into a selection. We classified the papers into a selection matrix, so we said, are they basic, are they clinical, which country are they in? And from that, we carried out a random selection to get 18 scientific papers. We then went to the researchers for each of those papers and built effectively a story or a narrative of what had happened in that research. So we read the publications, we did bibliometrics so we could trace the flow of knowledge, we examined archives from funders, we interviewed all the principal investigators and various other people involved in the project to understand exactly, or as well as we could, understand the story of that research and what had come out of it. And as we did that, we catalogued the benefits that had come out of the research. So we looked at what knowledge had been produced, what did they actually discover, what papers did they publish, did they get highly cited, those kind of questions. We looked at what future research they had affected, so we call it research targeting and capacity building. What interesting questions did they raise? What ways did they change the way research was done? We looked at how that information had flowed out of research and said, did it inform policy or did it change how a product was developed? Did someone take that information and develop a new product or a new intervention? And then we said, did that provide a health sector benefit or benefit to health? And did that provide an economic benefit? And that gives us a fantastic amount of information about those 18 pieces of research and the benefits that came from them. But what it doesn't do is it doesn't quantify that in any way. We have great narratives, we can tell great stories, but it's difficult then to work out what the wider implications of that are. So we had to focus that information. So the first way we did it is, for the narratives, we took key characteristics. So we coded the narratives. We said, for example, was the team involved in the research, were they motivated by seeing people in the clinic and wanting to help, or were they motivated by wanting to understand how the process worked? What drove them? Was it a multidisciplinary team? Did they have different types of people, or was it all the same? And then we had to reduce the information in the benefits, and we did that by getting a group of experts together, a group of 9 experts that spanned policy, healthcare and science policy, and said, can you give each of these case studies, each of these 18 pieces of research, a score for how well they do in terms of producing knowledge, how well they do in terms of changing the future of research, how well they do in terms of changing policy, how well they do in health and economics. And then we got that group to score and discuss those scores to try and generate a consensus. And here's an example. So this particular case study scored an 8. The maximum score was 9. And so that did very well in knowledge production. And then it kind of tailed off as it went towards broader economic benefit. And what that allowed us to do was to say, if we take the high impact case studies, the ones that have done particularly well for example, knowledge production, we can compare them to the low impact ones, and we can say, how are they similar and how are they different? So what characteristics seem to be associated with doing well? And one of the advantages here is that often science policy work says, let's look at things that have done really well and see what they have in common. But often it might be that the things that haven't done well had exactly the same things, but they haven't been looked at. And then once we had that initial information, we went back to the narratives, we went to the other science policy literature, and we said, can we test those emerging conclusions against that wider body of evidence, so we can test whether we're saying things that are new and how convinced we are by the evidence. Just very quickly, in terms of backward tracing cases, we looked at development of clozapine and use of clozapine. We looked at cognitive behavioural therapy and how that was developed, and the idea of supported employment. So we had a pretty, I guess the key point from this slide is we had quite a wide range of different types of intervention. We tried to make it broader than just looking at pharmacological type interventions. And we built those case studies, and we used those to test our conclusions as well. So do we see the same things in the forward-running stories as we do in the backward-running stories? So let's get back to the question I started with, which is, what type of research should you support? Should you support fundamental basic research, or should you support clinical research if you want to make a difference to patients? So if you look at the impact that comes from basic or fundamental research, does very well for knowledge, and it kind of tails off towards broader economic benefit, as you would expect, because that's what you're hoping it will produce, and over time it will produce that way. We're looking at things that started 20 years ago, and that's the comparison with clinical research. So if you want to have an impact on health or the economy, what our study suggests, and what our previous studies suggested over shorter timescales, is you want to be investing in clinical research. Which isn't to say basic research has no value, but over a 20-year timescale, you're getting more payback in terms of health from clinical research. There are obviously a series of caveats to that. It's quite possible that basic research has fewer, larger successes. This is case study research. We only have 18 cases in total. So it may well be that we've missed. If basic research has fewer, larger successes, we could quite possibly have missed them. It may be that basic research has an enormous impact over 30 or 40 years. So at that time scale, it would be much better. But we'll see, we can't look at that because we looked over 20 years. It's also possible that the impacts of basic research are harder to trace. So if the impact is very diffuse, or it goes through routes we didn't look at, and we tried by talking to people, doing bibliometrics, doing all kinds of approaches to trace as much as we could the flow of information from a particular grant. But there may be things that I'm sure there are things that we've missed. And it's also possible that basic research is required to subsequently do the applied research. Now, that's an argument that's often made, but it's also an argument that you can find examples. So thermodynamics, for example, was developed to explain how steam engines worked. It was not that steam engines were designed because there was an understanding of thermodynamics. So the tendency of society to invest in basic research may be the reason why discoveries emerge from basic research, because we do that basic research. If we did more applied research, discoveries might emerge from that. So our conclusion was that over 20 years, if you want an impact on health over 20 years, you should probably be funding clinical research or applied research. But we want to understand more about what the impacts of basic research are. So there's a couple of other characteristics which I'll talk about. Another way to think about funding research is, do you want to fund people who are world experts in a particular field, know everything there is to be known about a particular area, or do you want to fund people who span a range of areas, who can talk to people in different contexts, who can talk to both basic scientists and clinicians, for example? And certainly in the UK, the tendency in research funding is to pick the person who is the most expert. So to focus on narrow expertise, because depth is seen to be valuable. When we looked for the case studies that had impact, we found that of the high impact case studies, the vast majority of them, so 9 out of 10 I think, the teams or individuals spanned different areas. So they would either span different types of research, or they would span different disciplinary areas. So we concluded that actually, if you want impact on patients and health, you want to fund people who have that breadth, or teams who have that breadth. And that was also illustrated in some of our case studies. And this is an example of a scientist who said that he made a discovery, but he realized in order to put that into practice, he needed to learn how to change policy. So he went and learned how to change policy. So he was an example of somebody who spanned different areas. He took knowledge from one place and he put it into another place. And those kind of people seem to be really key in terms of changes in the system and having a health benefit. So we find that having an impact is associated with breadth. We suggest that funding agencies should support people who can do that and try and promote the ability of people to do that. The question this raises is, are those people, is it something innate about somebody that means they can span areas, or is it something you can teach people to do? Because if it's something you can teach people to do, you should be supporting people to do it. And then the last aspect I'm going to talk about today is commitment and motivation. Does it matter why you're doing your research, or does it have an effect on the kind of impact of your research? And we looked at two sort of types of motivation. A motivation where people talked about being motivated by the need of patients, and a motivation where people talked about being curiosity focused. I wanted to know how this worked. And what this shows is the case studies that were low impact in the different areas. So there's one low impact case study in economic under motivated by patient need. There's 3 case studies that were motivated by patient need which had a high economic impact. And this shows the equivalent for motivation with curiosity focused. And what you see is that most of the high impact stuff is motivated by patient need, most of the low impact stuff is curiosity focused. And it's not a complete dichotomy, but there's an indication that actually motivation seems to be important. Why you're doing stuff does seem to matter. And again, when we went back to the narratives, we found lots of people talking about why that was important. An example here is someone saying that seeing the patients was what really inspired them to do the research, and they didn't think they could do it without that. There was also, if we looked at the particular breakthroughs that we had followed backwards, Gil Hollingford, for example, was instrumental in the development of clozapine, and you could see by looking at the story that his motivation and his desire to make a difference to patients was kind of a key in driving that along. And the use of CBT in schizophrenia, there were a small group of UK researchers who were clearly tightly knit and highly motivated to drive that forward, and that was very important in the development of that in the UK. So we find that it's important, motivation is important, and committed individuals and champions are very important. The question is, I guess the policy provocation is can you identify that? Should you select for that? And again, a similar question to breadth and depth, can you grow that? Can you change people's motivations? Can you motivate them in ways that will make them more likely to have an impact? And one query we slightly have about this caveat is that, do people project their motivations on afterwards? So if you have had an impact on patients, do you subsequently tell yourself that the reason you did the work was to have an impact on patients. Whereas if you have advanced knowledge but not had an impact on patients, you tell yourself that the reason you did it was to try and understand the processes. Because all of this work is retrospective. We go back and we talk to people and we try and kind of cross-check against other sources, but in terms of people's motivations, you can't really cross-check, is what they tell you. So the aim of this work, and this is Tony Beck, who heads up the Graham Beck Foundation and was instrumental in kicking off this study, the aim is to try and start providing the evidence which allows us to say, how do you most effectively fund scientific research? So the subject matter is one thing, deciding what questions you address, but the other thing is, how can you best do that? How do you best deploy your funding? What sort of people do you want? Which ways do you want to apply it? And I will just finish up with a quick slide saying thank you to all the people who have funded my work, and thank you to all the people I've worked with on those projects. Thank you very much.